Okay, so I am doing my third video lecture. It is about the 18th and 19th century Scottish and British rhetoricians. And I have to say that I was sort of surprised at these theorists. I'm a child of the process revolution in composition teaching. Which started in the 70s, just as I was beginning my graduate education. And we all described these people like Alexander Bain and George Campbell as sort of the bad guys that process revolution revolted against. And although there are certainly some things about it that are not what I would support, they have, I think, some things to say. So I've subtitled this Three Scotsmen and an Anglican Clergy, because the four authors that you had to read for this week, Campbell, Blair, Whately, and Bain, the three of them, Campbell, Blair, and Bain, are Scottish, and only Richard Whately is not. Campbell and Blair were Scottish ministers. Bain was Scottish but not a minister. And Whately was an Anglican. He was English, but he was posted in the Anglican Church as in Dublin. So, and you can see from the dates here, they span a couple centuries. Campbell and Blair are from the 18th century, and Whately and Bain are from the 19th century. So we talked a lot about Kairos, and we certainly jumped a lot of centuries from Quintilian and Cicero to these rhetoricians. We have a much more complex society at this point. There is increasing literacy, although there's not mass literacy, but there certainly is increasing literacy. And because of the increasing literacy, there's also increasing genre diversity, both literary and non-literary. The novel, for example, is pretty much developing at this time. And prior to that point, there was no such thing as a novel. Because of the Industrial Revolution, there's a greater stratification of society into the middle and the working class. There's a rise in professions, people doing all sorts of different kinds of professions, as opposed to back in Greek and Latin society. And all of this leads to many more uses for discourse, especially written discourse. The educational institutions are much different at this point. English is the language of education, no longer Greek and Latin. If we covered some of the Middle Ages, we'd have seen where those who were educated tended to be educated in the classical languages. There's a development of something called an English department, which before that was not thought to be needed. Because at least in the English speaking world, because people already knew English. And so they wouldn't need to go to school to learn it. But an English department starts developing because they start teaching English literature there. And the teaching of English literature, before there were classics departments, and you had to learn Greek and Latin in order to read it. And that was the focus, learning the language in order to read it. But now people know the language, presumably, but they need to be taught to read literature. And they're also being taught to teach composition. And you'll see in their various instructions that they have certain perspectives about the people who they are teaching and what they know and don't know. And some populations need to study English for social mobility. We're not so much interested in them learning English, but rather learning proper English. So I'm going to talk about all four of these in sort of as a summary. And I try to distinguish between them. At the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them separately. But they all believe that good rhetoric is rhetoric that achieves its purpose. And Campbell says that eloquence is that art or talent by which the discourse is adapted to its end. Blair says that rhetoric is eloquence, and eloquence is the art of speaking in such a manner as to attain the end for which we speak. And Bain says, rhetoric discusses the means whereby language, spoken or written, may be rendered effective. So this language being effective, meeting its end, is the general kind of sense of what they think rhetoric is. This is somewhat different from classical rhetoric, where we have somebody like Aristotle saying rhetoric is the available means of persuasion, and there the focus is much more on persuasion and on actually just finding out what those means are. Because of literacy, rhetoric expands to include writing as well as speaking. Blair says it is obvious that writing and discourse are objects entitled to the highest attention. So discourse in his vocabulary is oral discourse, and writing is the written. Whately says most of the rules for speaking are, of course, applicable equally to writing. And I think that's kind of interesting that he says, of course, as if there might not even be considered a difference. And Bain says, rhetoric discusses the means whereby language, spoken or written, may be rendered effective. So the teaching of rhetoric becomes much broader than just persuasion. And they include exposition and imaginative discourse as well as persuasion. And even if they're talking about persuasion, they're very much interested in the imagination and how you can appeal to people's imagination. These are not people who talk at great length about logic and syllogisms. And although they do bring it up, but they're interested in other kinds of approaches, other kind of faculties of the human mind. And note that exposition is something that is informative writing of some kind. That only becomes important when you have this more complex society where people need to be provided information about things. People need to learn specific things, how to do things. The way to do that is in texts, and books are published so that you have books that have recipes and self-help and suggestions about how to run a household or run a business. So Campbell said that all the ends of speaking are reducible to four: to enlighten the understanding, to please the imagination, to move the passions, or to influence the will. So the first is informative. The second is to please which would cover both the literary and more lightweight kind of humorous type things. The third is to move the passions, and the fourth to influence the will, which is where we get the persuasion. Bain uses similar terms, only has three, but he says there are three principal ends: to inform, to persuade, to please, corresponding to the three departments of the human mind: the understanding, the will, and the feelings. Bain, by the way, was one of the early psychologists, and he is supposed to have been a very popular lecturer on psychology, even though he was an unpopular lecturer on rhetoric. Maybe I think perhaps because there is so much knowledge now having developed that rhetoric becomes more interested in style than invention of content. I was really noticing, Blair said, if you really think you want to use the topo and the Stacy's and all these other things, go ahead, but it's trivial and you'll end up with a writing that's mechanical. And he says, instead of developing these invention strategies, just think deeply. He also says, knowledge and science must furnish the materials that form the body and substance of any valuable composition. Rhetoric serves to add the polish. And so you really see, and this is where the process theory tended to challenge what was called the current traditional rhetoric that developed out of this. They tended to see rhetoric and the teaching of rhetoric as sort of the form that you pour the content into, and the content comes from somewhere else. Whately says, as the possession of building materials is no part of the art of architecture, though it is impossible to build without materials, so the knowledge of the subjects on which the orator is to speak constitutes no part. So this is very different from Cicero, and actually you see Whately making fun of Cicero, and also the sophists, who seem to suggest that to be a great rhetorician, you need to know everything so that you have the material to talk about. But in fact, when Bain, who is the most recent of these, and you see how uninterested he is in content, so that he ends up saying that there's a burden for the teacher of finding matter as well as language, and belongs rather to classes of scientific or other instruction than to a class of English. For an English exercise, the matter should in some way or other be supplied, and the pupil disciplined in giving it expression. So this is a very interesting thing, because on the one hand, it supports an idea of writing across the curriculum, and suggests that the real writing of something substantive would belong when you know something and you learn about it in some other course. But it's also problematic because it suggests that writing is somehow an abstraction that has nothing to do with the content in which you are writing about, or the situation, as if it's just this generic kind of thing. And it leaves the English department course of composition into being able to only pretty much talk about the surface of texts. And he, of course, does develop certain principles that are sort of connected to other disciplines, but he ends up saying that all good writing would be in a certain way, with a paragraph, and then he describes those paragraphs. Now, it's not quite as formalistic as some of their peers. In the textbook, we have some more pages from this Austin's Chironomia, and he is an 18th century elocutionist. These are the positions you stand in, or the ways in which you hold your hands to express certain points of view. As I said, they tend not to be that interested in logic and the reasoning part. They're much more interested in the emotional element of discourse, and passion is one of their common terms. Rhetoric, they say, well, Blair says, high eloquence is always the offspring of passion, that state of mind in which it is agitated and fired by some object it has in view. And Campbell says, the passions are the natural spurs to volition or action, and so need only to be right directed. So they're very much more interested in not so much the substance or the invention, but actually the way in which you deliver it in sort of an emotional kind of way, so as to affect your hearers or readers. Now, they all end up having to do, just like the earlier rhetoricians did, and just like current rhetoricians do, they all have to defend rhetoric from claims about its dark side. They all have to say, well, you know, some people think rhetoric is deception, but rather, they will argue, as Campbell does, when you use tools to manage and address the audience, it is not deception. The different powers of the mind, the imagination, the memory, and the passions are not the supplanters of reason or even the rivals, they are handmaids. And Campbell says also, our eyes and hands and feet will give us the same assistance in doing mischief as in doing good, but it would not therefore be better for the world that all mankind were blind and lame. I thought this was the most concise kind of image of expression of sort of the conundrum posed by rhetoric and its connection to truth and goodness. It's interesting because he specifically uses an analogy, which is one of the things many of them talk about, and sort of a figure of speech, and it gives you a more kind of in-depth sense of what the issue is. Blair does something similar. Reason, eloquence, and every art which has ever been studied among mankind may be abused and may prove dangerous in the hands of bad men. But it were perfectly childish to contend that upon this account they ought to be abolished. So he's making the same point and calling it childish as well. And I think Whatley tries to sort of split the difference by saying that that you can tell the difference between truth and falsehood, and so it's fine to develop, if alternate points of view develop their arguments. Truth, having an intrinsic superiority over falsehood, may be expected to prevail when the skill of the contending parties is equal, which is more likely to take place the more widely such skill is diffused. And I liked how he also added how, the more everybody knows this, then the more there is egalitarian ability. this is kind of the principle behind legal arguments. That is that if both sides are excellent at arguing, then truth will somehow out. So those were the general common kind of characteristics. And here is just a few things to bring up about each particular person. So Blair is often mentioned in connection with the Belle art or Beaux-Arts or belletristic movement. He is very interested in literary criticism, and he is as much interested in literary criticism as much as writing and speaking. And here again is one of the other ways in which the process movement fought back against the current traditional mode of teaching writing that kind of developed out of these 18th, 19th century authors, where the writing program was part of a literature program or an English department. And the whole process of learning to write was sort of centered on learning how to read literature, because for Blair, he said that one of the things that you learn is the taste, and just when you focus on literature and good literature, you learn this thing he calls taste and discernment. And that will help you then produce grace and elegance when writing. Really did think a really interesting point he made was why to teach writing. It's basically an articulation of the writing as a mode of learning idea, which again is a very current contemporary view. By putting our sentiments into words, we always conceive them more distinctly. So close is the connection between thoughts and the words in which they are clothed. And you see that again, his idea that what you're learning is how to clothe them, your ideas, with words. And it's the polish, it's the surface. But he still sees the relationship between it. And then he also talks a lot about what you might call rhetoric for social mobility. He says, for example, learning to read literature furnishes materials for fashionable topics of discourse, thereby enabling us to support a proper rank in social life. So he is interested in making sure his students learn enough English in all its ways, literature, composition, and oratory, so that they can do well in society or in employment. And Blair, by the way, was one of the Scottish ministers. Whately was really interesting. His focus a lot is on the teaching, and I've heard that he was supposedly kind of an odd guy. He's the one that was the Anglican minister. But he's the one that focuses a lot on coming up with topics that are interesting to his pupils. And he himself puts the emphasis on the word interesting. He argues for real writing instead of vapid exercises you don't care about, which pretty much sounds like some of the stuff that Bain did, the vapid exercises. And he hopes his treatise, this is how he ends one section, will be used by those engaged in meeting the occasions of real life. So he's a very practical person in some sense. Thinking about writing as part of the necessary things that they have to do in society. Bain is a lot like Blair in this idea of discriminating and focusing on reading examples, because he says that he's teaching students to discriminate between good and bad in expression. Bain is most known for having invented the modes, and sometimes they're called the modes of invention. He did not call them the modes of invention. He sees them more as sort of genres. What happened in current traditional teaching of rhetoric was that students were taught to write descriptions and narrations and expositions, and sort of as paragraph types. And that's connected to his other big claim to fame, which was that he focused on the paragraph as somehow the unit of thought. He is not at all interested in persuasion. So unlike the others, he focuses solely on exposition. And it was notable that he mentions his mentors at the beginning, the people who, this is what he wants to aspire to. And they happen to be the other three authors I asked you to read. This was not intentional, but so he mentions Campbell, Blair, and Whitley. And it's notable that he does not mention Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero. Some of the others, especially Blair and Campbell, the earlier ones, do mention the classical writers. So this is my little brief overview. It's an expansion a little bit of the written overview that I put into Blackboard. We are going to have a discussion in Blackboard about asking you which ideas are useful to you. So at this point, I'd like you, having heard this and read the overview, now go read the actual text. I've selected very small sections from the whole longer ones, hopefully so that you can focus on some of these ideas. Our discussion will focus on this question: which ideas are useful to you?